One of the biggest mistakes that we can make when we're pitching ourselves to podcasts is thinking that it's all about us.
Different than a podcast, you've been brought on to actually talk about what you do.
When you're pitching yourself to a podcast, you really have to avoid just telling people how great you are.
Why would someone who has a business want to be a guest on other people's podcasts?
Borrowed audience. It's borrowed credibility.
They've been invited on a podcast, therefore they must matter, they must be important, they must know what they're talking about.
So Mark, in this episode, we are going to be talking about crafting compelling pitches to land guest spots on podcasts. That is what I do every single day for my clients. So it's definitely one of the things that I love talking about, sort of figuring out what works, what doesn't. And I've done a lot of it over the years. I do have a bit of a framework for just three key things really that I include in every single podcast pitch. So I can kick us off by
I'd
going
love
through
to hear it, because you've landed me on a few interesting podcasts over the last few months, and I'll talk about them in a bit, what it's been like for me to be on as a guest, because I think people need to think about that as well. They've maybe not got a podcast yet, but somebody like you know, that you're helping them become a guest. What does that feel like? What's the experience like? So I can talk a bit about that.
Definitely. So 3 things I make sure I include in every podcast pitch. Number 1 is the value that this guest can bring. So if you're pitching to a podcast, you need to tell them, what can you contribute? What can you bring to the table? Why will it benefit their audience from hearing what you've got to say? That's really, really important. The second thing is authority. So who are you to even share all these points and information? What experience do you have? What's your expertise, achievements, accolades, anything? A few sentences just on why you are someone to be listened to and trusted in this area.
That's kind of like what we do at the start of these episodes, isn't it? We're sort of trying to, in 10 seconds, summarise who we are and why people should give us their time.
Yeah, exactly. And the podcast host needs to understand who you are and that you understand that that's important as well. And the third thing is basically reach. So it's how you can help the podcast achieve their goals. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that we can make when we're pitching ourselves to podcasts is thinking that it's all about us. And we need to talk about ourselves all the time. We need to remember the podcast, the host wants to achieve their own goals. They've got, reasons for wanting to grow their podcast. And so you have to tell them, look, I can help share the episode to my social media audience. I'll put it on my website. I'll send it out on my email list. I will introduce you to, a couple of people that I think might be, good connections for you. You don't have to do all those things, but you have to show that part of your role is to help them grow through getting more eyes on your episode. And I think that's really important as well. If you've got a good social media following, let them know. Other interesting things to include is, if you've got a podcast that you've previously appeared on that you're quite proud of, or it's quite a good one to tell people about, include that as well. But they're the core 3 things that I think you need to include.
In the first episode, we talked about the why. And I think we need to bring that question back into it. Why would someone who has a business want to be a guest on other people's podcasts?
Well, it's borrowed audience. It's borrowed credibility. You're tapping into someone else's core audience, and the podcast host is effectively shining a spotlight on you as the guest, and they're saying to their audience, I've chosen this person. This is somebody that I think it'll be helpful for you to hear. Basically, they're probably the 2 main reasons. Being a podcast guest is also an incredible use of your time because it doesn't take long, especially if you're recording remotely, but even if you're travelling somewhere to do something in person, the hour that you might spend chatting on that podcast, you could be getting you in front of 100 people, 200 people or more. You just don't know. So it's a great way to get in front of people that doesn't take a huge amount of time or expense actually. And the more you do it, the better you become. The better a speaker you become, the better an educator you become. So there's tons of reasons. It helps people get to know you. It helps people sort of get to trust you. It's a great chance for you to share your knowledge in a particular field and build that connection, and then take people from the podcast audience over into your container and sort of nurture them from there.
I think as well, the whole thing about where you do the podcast is important, where you're the guest on a podcast, I should say. So if you get invited to a studio, for example, or maybe the podcast that you're going to be a guest on, they've got a wee recording space set up.
Yeah.
And you go there, when you're being filmed and recorded, assuming there's video as well, you're going to get clips from them, I would imagine, that place you in that kind of authority paradigm of sitting in front of a microphone, talking about your area of expertise. You know, that whole thing, like you see a clip of somebody in front of a mic like this.
You don't see who they're talking to.
No, you don't see who they're talking to, but there's something in the back of your mind when you see that. You go, oh, they've been invited on a podcast, therefore they must matter, they must be important, they must know what they're talking about. Now, whether there's any truth in that is up to you to decide when you actually listen, but there's that kind of authority paradigm that you're immediately placed into when you're on somebody's podcast.
Definitely. And it's like a drip feeding of that credibility. When people see you appearing on a podcast like 1 month, and then a couple of months later you're on another one, and then maybe the next month you might be doing a talk on a stage, and then you're on another podcast, and all the time they're thinking, this person's actually sounds like they're the real deal. And that's exactly what you want people to think. But coming back to what you said there about getting the clips, that's actually becoming much more popular and common, is for the host to be, for the guest, to ask the host to share the raw footage. Because the interesting thing is, the host will pull out different clips for what they want. And actually sometimes the guest, if they took it away, they can pull out different clips again that serve the message that they want to share to their own particular audience. So it is becoming a lot more common for guests to ask hosts to share the raw footage with them. And I mean, it does benefit both, as long as you're tagging each other and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's that shared eyes, shared ears. You know, you're getting a slice of, you're getting exposure to their audience, whether on the podcast itself or on their socials, and then vice versa. Their podcast, if you share the clips on to your socials, that podcast is getting exposure to your network as well. Shall I share a couple of experiences? Yeah. But it's kind of one main experience. So you'd landed me as a guest on a few different podcasts over the last few months. The last one that I was on, the guy was a great host, and we'll have an episode on our podcast talking about if you're hosting a guest, how you should be. But this guy was great. He sort of gave me the open field of play to run into and to talk about my area of expertise, which is podcasting. But here was the thing, right? He was talking about that managing expectations of audience numbers that we talked about in the first episode. And I found myself saying, I heard myself saying, we need to forget viral and think tribal. And then I started to talk about, stop chasing big numbers, but chase a tribal audience that will be really passionate and enthusiastic about what your business does. But see, after I said it, we both kind of had that a moment of going, well, that was quite good, wasn't it? Now, off the back of me just being given that, area of field, open grass to run into, I said that. I had never thought that clearly in my head before. But it's that thing when you step away from your business for an hour to go on a podcast as a guest. And if the guest is good enough to give you that space to express yourself, you never know what wee gems you might come out with that are clippable and that can then turn themselves into a new arrowhead for your marketing campaign, which is exactly what happened in that instance.
Exactly. And if you've been aligned well, if you've pitched out to a podcast that's a great fit, then the conversations you can have just flow quite freely. They're very creative, and sometimes podcast hosts can challenge you, or they can make you think differently about things. They can ask you questions that you've not really considered in any detail before, and that's all great for growth and just perspective and everything like that.
Hey, sorry to interrupt. Now, just think, because it's a wee bit different from a networking event. If you bump into somebody for the first time at a networking event, and the question is, so what is it you do? And you've got like 15 seconds to tell them, right? It's different on a podcast. You've been brought on to actually talk about what you do. And as you said, if it's a good fit, if the host is right, they'll be able to hopefully take you into places and pull out of you things about your business and expertise, or your thoughts on the industry that you work in that maybe you've not had the chance to express before.
Exactly. And I think I was just going to say, when you're pitching yourself to a podcast, you really have to avoid just telling people how great you are.
Of course.
And it's easy to think that, well, why would they not want to know that?
Yeah.
But that's not what you would be talking about on the podcast, though. You wouldn't just be showing up and telling folk how great you are, or you just wouldn't end up on many podcasts. But you've got to show how you can serve. And I do think, like, in terms of like a big pitfall, make sure A, your podcast pitches are not too long, and B, that it's not just like an ego trip for you. It's got to be with serving the audience in mind.
Yeah. And you're right, because let's go back to the clips, the shareability factor of your guest appearance. If you've just droned on and on for 45 minutes, you know, recounting business successes that you've had, how clippable is that? You know, people like to hear real stuff. People like to hear the times that it maybe wasn't too great or you've overcome something. That's the stuff that ends up being clippable, you know. So it's like you're not there just to boast for 45 minutes or an hour. You've got to be real.
Yeah, because you're there to build the connection, and you're not going to build that connection if you don't open up and talk about the highs, the lows. You know, you've got to be there to help others learn on their journey from what you know already. That's your reason for being there, is to share your knowledge and lessons learned.
Another thing that I think is important to consider is the technical side of things. You know, if you're successful in being invited to be a guest on podcasts, but you show up onto the remote recording, because a lot of the times it is remote, right? And I think that suits everybody these days, you know. I know my own experience, the ones that I've been on, they've all been remote. You know, I can step into one of the studio spaces here, log into the call, do my thing, and then I'm back at my desk 3 minutes later, right? It's really, really easy. So if you're being invited on as a remote guest and it sounds awful, your end sounds awful, you know, you're using the mic on the laptop, you can hear other members of staff in the background, or you're doing it from home and you're sitting in the kitchen and there's that echoey kitchen sound, you might not get invited onto many more podcasts afterwards, particularly if the ones that you're reaching out to go and listen to previous episodes. The simple reason being, it gives the host and their production process a lot more work to clean up that audio. Yeah. And if they're not able to do that, your message is going to be completely lost in a sea of poor sounding audio. So therefore, the audience that you're hoping to reach in this podcast are probably going to skip to the next episode. Yeah, and it's not the perception that they want for their own podcast either. They want it to look professional and to be enjoyable for people to tune into. The other thing I would say when it comes to pitching is fully expect to have to do intro calls sometimes. Podcast hosts quite often say, I'll have a 15-minute intro call with them just to double check that we've got enough themes in common, that, you know, we've got that vibe between us, that we know what we're going to talk about when we come to record the episode. So don't be like, oh God, intro call, you know, it's part of the process, and actually it's another opportunity for you to just build the connection with that podcast host. So intro calls are quite common, and you just show up, chat like it's, you know, it's not an interview, but it's just a good way of getting to know each other. I mean, a few of our clients regularly bring in remote guests. They'll actually use this room, so the host, our client, will sit in here, and you know, when the remote podcast studio fires up and the guest joins, and if I see that they've got a properly lit, because more and more people have got this at home for doing like Zoom calls or recording kind of talking head content, but they've got a nicely lit and presented room, they've got a real microphone in front of them. I know my job as the producer is going to be a hell of a lot easier. I also know that the guest is going to come over significantly better on the clips. They've not got the kind of artificially blurred out Zoom call background, you know, that there's not that kind of tinny laptop microphone sound. So I think, you know, and I know I'm hammering this point, but if you want to get taken seriously as a podcast guest, if you feel that's a great way for your PR, your marketing to get yourself out there, think about the recording environment and the recording equipment that you're going to be using. And I highly recommend podcast guesting as a business PR strategy, definitely. I mean, there's just so many out there to choose from. I don't think I've ever had, well, I know I've never had a client that I couldn't find any podcast for, you know, and I've got some niche clients,
but there's just so many out there.
Yeah, and that's the beautiful thing about podcasting is there's so many niche podcasts.
Yeah.
You know, it's not Channel 4. It's not trying to be Sky.
Yeah, exactly.
It can be whatever it wants to be.
And they've got the people in their audience that you want to talk to. And that's the key.
Yeah. And that's going to become a theme in our podcast is having that eye on the audience, not the massive audience numbers, but the niche audience, that you're the right person to hear from for whatever problem or need that their business or their life may have. You're going to be the right person to speak to them.
Exactly. I think that probably brings episode 2 to a close.
I think it does.
Thank you for tuning in, and we'll be back next time.